We have a vanity problem. You, I, and every ancestor who ever walked the earth, we believe in the fundamental, immutable law of progress. We look back at the millions of years of hominid history and see only a relentless upward climb. From Australopithecus scrambling in the trees to Homo erectus mastering fire to Neanderthals surviving the brutal ice until finally us, Homo sapiens, the wise man, the culmination. We tell ourselves a comforting story that begins with weakness and ends with unparalleled complexity. We map our evolutionary path as a highway, always speeding up, always heading toward greater intelligence, greater adaptability, greater capacity. This narrative is woven into our architecture, our technology, our understanding of history. We built the rockets, we wrote the operas, we split the atom. How could the machine that created all of this be anything but constantly improving? We are arrogant because we have proof of external progress. Look at the pyramids, the massive infrastructure projects of Rome, the sheer scope of the Industrial Revolution. Our physical footprint on the planet is a testament to exponential growth. If you measure human success by how much we can move, build, or destroy, the curve only goes up. But history is rarely that clean, and human biology is perhaps the dirtiest part of history we have. What if the great, terrifying truth hidden in the fossil record, a truth that contemporary science is now forced to grapple with, is that the pinnacle was already reached and we have been quietly, subtly regressing for the last 20,000 years? We need to talk about the skull, specifically the thing inside it. For all our advancements in genetics and computation, the brain remains the fundamental, terrifying engine of our species. And the raw, physical evidence we have dug up, measured, and calculated suggests that the single most defining characteristic of Homo sapiens, our cranial capacity, has been diminishing since the end of the last ice age. This is not a conspiracy theory born in a dusty corner of the internet. This is a consensus forming slowly and reluctantly across anthropology, archaeology, and neuroscience. It is backed by metrics. Our species, modern Homo sapiens, reached its maximum cranial size roughly 20,000 years ago, maybe even 30,000 years ago, depending on the population you look at. Think about that time frame. This was the moment of our greatest physical and environmental challenge. Our ancestors were weathering the last glacial maximum, the deep, numbing cold of the late Pleistocene. They were pioneering the most extreme environments on Earth, perfecting the spear thrower, painting the breathtaking, intricate narratives on the walls of Lascaux and Chauvet. They were, biologically, at their evolutionary peak, and then it stopped. The measurements are undeniable. Across multiple geographic regions and different population groups, the trend is consistent. Based on the averages calculated from thousands of fossil specimens from Europe, Asia, and the Americas, the human brain has decreased in volume by approximately 10%. 10%. That sounds small, but in biological terms, that is catastrophic. To put it in a frighteningly tangible way, our modern brains are, on average, roughly 150 to 200 cubic centimeters smaller than the brains of our Paleolithic predecessors. Imagine taking a piece of your brain, roughly the size of a tennis ball or a slightly oversized baseball, and simply removing it. That is the physical reality of the involution we are talking about. We tend to think of brain evolution like a rocket launch, continuous thrust toward greater complexity. But the scientific data tells a different story. It shows that, at some point between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, our rocket engine sputtered, leveled off, and began a slow, silent descent. The great scientific tragedy here is the timing. If our brains had shrunk 200,000 years ago, we might attribute it to archaic changes in diet or a loss of necessary stimulus. But this regression began precisely at the moment. Homo sapiens was preparing for its greatest leaps, the shift from mobile hunter-gatherer bands to settled communities, the invention of agriculture, the creation of fixed civilizations. The prevailing historical narrative insists that settling down required more intelligence. It required complex planning, mathematical abstraction, sophisticated management of irrigation, and intense social stratification. We shifted from hunting mammoth, a pursuit requiring unparalleled physical intelligence, spatial mapping, and deep ecological knowledge, to managing a field of barley. We assume that since the environment became easier, since technology replaced brute force, we must have gotten smarter, more efficient. But what if efficiency isn't the same as capacity? The moment we stabilized our food supply, the moment we began to live in dense, complex societies, we started outsourcing our memory, our planning, and our physical dexterity. We externalized our knowledge onto walls, clay tablets, and eventually servers. And, perhaps, our biology responded to this massive shift in cognitive workload by doing something entirely unexpected. We know that brain size is not the only metric for intelligence. If size were the only measure, the sperm whale would be solving complex differential equations. What matters is density, structure, and the ratio of brain mass to body mass. However, a reduction in absolute volume of this magnitude across an entire species is a warning sign. It suggests a systemic change in the biological requirements for survival. Imagine the greatest hunter of the Upper Paleolithic, a person who knew how to track a solitary reindeer across hundreds of miles of frozen tundra, how to manufacture a dozen types of highly specialized tools from chert, how to navigate the complex constellations of the night sky, and how to survive a week without fire in sub-zero temperatures. That hunter required a massive, instantaneous processing unit capable of handling unparalleled volumes of raw sensory data and immediate problem solving. Now look at us. We are specialists, not generalists. We are interdependent. You know how to operate a device that connects you to the entire history of human knowledge, but you likely couldn't survive 3 days alone in a forest without your phone. We live in a world of staggering technological complexity, yet we have delegated the crucial functions of deep, raw survival intelligence to the collective. And the question becomes terrifyingly simple. Did the human brain, after millions of years of relentless struggle towards self-awareness, finally surrender the fight? Did we, in the quiet moment we transitioned from the age of ice to the age of grain, decide that being intensely smart was no longer necessary? We fear the collapse of civilization, the collapse of our atmosphere, or the collapse of our economy. But the archaeological record hints at a far deeper, more existential crisis. The Dark Age that began not with a bomb or a plague, but with the subtle, insidious acceptance of mediocrity. We optimized our societies, yes, but in doing so, we appear to have optimized our own brains, right out of their maximum capacity. What does it say about humanity that our ultimate moment of evolutionary physical decline coincided precisely with the invention of the civilization we rely on? Did the Paleolithic hunter pay the biological price for the farmer's comfort? Did we trade individual genius for collective stability? And if we did, what did that exchange actually cost us? 200 cubic centimeters at a time. 200 cubic centimeters. It sounds like a rounding error, right? When we talk about the sprawling, incomprehensible complexity of the human mind, losing a few hundred units of volume feels abstract. But let's put this in perspective. That is the size of a substantial orange. That is a measurable, definitive chunk of gray matter that simply vanished from the human lineage in the blink of an evolutionary eye. The last 20,000 years. We're talking about the difference between the average cranial capacity of the robust hunter-gatherers who walked the earth during the Ice Age, the Cro-Magnon who survived the absolute worst conditions nature could throw at them, and the average cranial capacity of the Neolithic farmers who founded our cities. The biggest, most complex brains we know of, in terms of sheer size, belong to people who lived in caves and hunted mammoths. Think about that for a second. The people who established agriculture, wrote the first laws, and began the march toward the skyscrapers we inhabit, possessed smaller physical minds than their nomadic, rugged ancestors. This isn't some crackpot speculation about ancient astronauts. This is the consensus among paleoneurologists and bioarchaeologists who measure thousands of fossil and subfossil skulls. The data is clear, starting roughly 20,000 years ago and accelerating sharply around 10,000 years ago when we decided to settle down. Our most important organ began to shrink. Why? That is the billion-dollar question that forces us to stare straight into the face of our own uncomfortable evolutionary truth. Why, at the precise moment we launched civilization, did we begin to downsize the hardware that made us capable of launching it in the first place? To understand the scale of this dark age we inflicted upon ourselves, we have to look at the primary academic hypotheses, the scientific theories that attempt to explain the great cranial collapse. And every single one of them points directly toward the social contract. They point toward us. The most famous, the most unsettling, and the most compelling theory is called the Self-Domestication Hypothesis. Think about how we domesticate animals. When a species transitions from a wild state to living alongside humans, think wolves becoming dogs or wild cattle becoming docile livestock, something fascinating and repeatable happens to their biology. They often retain juvenile features, neoteny, their faces flatten slightly, their coat colors change, and crucially, the aggression centers of their brains shrink. Specifically, structures associated with reactivity, stress management, and intense vigilance become less necessary. The domesticated animal no longer needs that instant, massive fight-or-flight response to survive. Did we do that to ourselves? Did we, by transitioning from the harsh, high-stakes environment of the Paleolithic wilderness to the relatively predictable, low-stakes environment of the early village, essentially domesticate humanity? The Ice Age hunter had to be a walking encyclopedia of survival. You had to have an incredible spatial memory to track prey across hundreds of miles of unmarked tundra. You had to maintain fierce vigilance for both predators and rival tribes. Failure to calculate the trajectory of a spear or misidentifying a poisonous berry meant immediate death. The cognitive demand for individual sharpness was absolutely ruthless. Now, fast forward to the Neolithic farmer. The pressure changes. Life is still brutally hard, but the type of hardness is different. Your primary job is now collaboration. You need to manage a stable water source, defend the communal grain stores, and coordinate the planting schedule. Instead of needing hypervigilance to survive alone, you need tolerance and cooperation to survive together. If the community protects you, you don't need the maximum individual capacity for aggression or constant alertness. The brain stops rewarding that extreme, expensive vigilance. We traded sharp teeth for soft hands. We traded primal fury for collective chatter. We traded the necessity of individual genius for the efficiency of the collective system. When you simplify the evolutionary necessity for extreme aggressive intelligence, you also remove the biological cost of maintaining it. And that brings us to the second closely linked theory, the energy storage hypothesis. Let's be brutally honest about the brain. It's an energy hog. Your brain accounts for about 2% of your total body weight, yet it sucks up around 20% of your daily caloric intake. It is by far the most expensive piece of biological machinery you own. For 2 million years, our ancestors prioritized brain size because the rewards, better tools, better hunting strategies, better survival, outweighed the immense energetic cost. But then came farming. Agriculture, while brilliant for producing consistent calories and allowing population density, was historically terrible for nutrition diversity, especially early on. Instead of the varied protein, fat, and micronutrients gained from hunting and gathering, early farming communities often relied on monocrops, rice, wheat, corn, that resulted in nutritional stress, anemia, and shorter, less healthy bodies. When faced with scarcity or stress, even if that stress is relative stability built on nutrient-poor grain, the body makes calculated cuts. Where is the first place a body undergoing stress and nutritional deficiencies will cut costs? The most expensive organ that is no longer absolutely essential for moment-to-moment survival, the brain. If you don't need to outsmart a saber-toothed cat today and your calorie count is down, the body says, we can shed a bit of that computational power. It's an unnecessary luxury. We stabilized our energy supply, yes, but in doing so, we introduced a pervasive, subtle, chronic malnutrition and decreased the cognitive demand for the kind of chaotic, high-level problem-solving the Paleolithic life required. What we sacrificed was brain tissue responsible for processing that intense, chaotic information flow, the areas associated with spatial reasoning, complex survival calculations, and maybe, just maybe, raw processing speed. We optimized our diet for survival and population growth, but not for maximum intellectual horsepower. This leads us to a truly terrifying thought experiment, and one that academic researchers are wrestling with right now. If we lost 200 cubic centimeters of our brain, the organ responsible for everything we are, did we fundamentally become less intelligent? Did we trade hardwired primal genius for something softer, more communal, and undeniably less sharp? We look back at those Paleolithic hunters, those anatomically modern humans who navigated an ice age without maps or calendars, and we see raw, aggressive intelligence focused on survival. We look at ourselves living in this sprawling, complex civilization, and we have to ask, is this brain of ours, the one built on the efficiencies of collaboration and stability, truly the superior model? Or is it merely the optimized model, the cheaper, mass-produced version, built to run a system we created but incapable of surviving the wilderness our ancestors mastered? We have defined civilization as the ultimate achievement. But what if, biologically, it was the ultimate surrender? And what does that tell us about the future when we hand over the last vestiges of our high-stakes problem-solving, like driving, tracking, and complex calculation, to algorithms and networked AI? If we optimize ourselves out of the need for individual intelligence, what happens when the collective network inevitably collapses? Did the Paleolithic hunter pay the ultimate biological price for the farmer's comfort? Yes, and we are still paying the interest. We talk about paying the interest, but let's actually look at the ledger. It's not some abstract evolutionary tweak we're discussing. The physical reduction, the loss of actual gray and white matter, is measurable, substantial, and frankly, terrifying. We are talking about a loss of somewhere between 10 to 15% of our brain volume since the peak size achieved by those magnificent, rugged people we call the Upper Paleolithic humans. Think about that for a second. 10 to 15%. Take a baseball, maybe a tennis ball, and imagine scooping that amount of complex tissue out of your own skull. Gone. We are structurally different. We are literally less massive in the head than the people who painted the caves of Lascaux or figured out how to cross the Bering Strait. And where did this loss happen? The exact mapping is complex, of course, but the consensus suggests that the areas dealing with acute, high-stakes processing, spatial reasoning, visual tracking, immediate environmental assessment, those took the hit first. Maybe the occipital and parietal lobes. The regions that screamed, danger, track, escape, at 50,000 years ago. You, the modern human reading this, you are operating on a budget version of the hardware your ancestors used. That's the brutal truth. So why? Why did we abandon the most valuable biological asset ever developed on this planet? Why, after millions of years of relentless uphill battle to accumulate more computing power, did we suddenly hit the reverse button around 20,000 years ago, accelerating the shrinkage during the agricultural revolution? This is where we dive into the theories, and I warn you, they are not comforting. They all point toward one central tragedy: success breeds softness. The primary and arguably most chilling theory is the one of self-domestication. We didn't just domesticate goats and corn, we domesticated ourselves. Look at any animal we've brought out of the wild: dogs, cattle, pigs. When we breed them for docility, For comfort around humans and for reliability, they invariably develop a set of physical traits known as the domestication syndrome. Their snouts get shorter, their teeth smaller, their coat color changes, their stress reactivity decreases, and crucially, their brains shrink. The cost of being less aggressive, less reactive, and more cooperative is a smaller brain. We, as a species, exhibit the same exact syndrome. Our faces have become flatter and smaller, reducing the sheer size of the facial scaffolding needed for massive canine teeth and powerful bite muscles. Our sexual dimorphism, the difference in size and structure between men and women, has decreased dramatically since the Pleistocene. Men became less physically aggressive, less immediately dominant, and less reliant on pure brute force because the cost of intermale conflict in a settled society was too high. We began favoring, breeding, and protecting the cooperative, the organized, the ones who could live in close proximity without constantly stabbing each other over resources. We selected for tolerance, sometimes called tameness. Think about that implication. We weren't selecting for intelligence in the wild, rugged, problem-solving sense. We were selecting for behavioral compliance and low levels of reactive aggression. We effectively bred the crazy out of our DNA, but we threw out a chunk of the underlying raw computing power required for that intense, aggressive intelligence. We traded the ability to outsmart a woolly mammoth solo for the ability to file tax returns as a group. If that sounds harsh, remember the context. The Paleolithic world rewarded the brilliant outlier who could solve a unique survival crisis. The Neolithic world, the civilization we inhabit, rewards the brilliant collaborator who can maintain the system. But there is a second major academic theory, one that works hand in hand with domestication. The social brain hypothesis and the cost of computing. Your brain is incredibly expensive. It makes up only 2% of your body mass, but it consumes 20% of your total resting energy budget. To fuel a big brain, you need constant, high-quality nutrition and the metabolic machinery to handle it. Our ancient ancestors, the ones with the big brains, had to be walking encyclopedias of survival. They needed individual, massive mental maps of hundreds of square miles, complex knowledge of thousands of plants and animal behaviors, and the capacity for immediate, high-stakes calculus. If I throw the spear at this angle, compensating for wind and distance, I eat today. Then civilization happened. Instead of needing 5 people who all know how to build a boat, find the medicinal herbs, track a deer, and make a fire, you only need 1 expert in each area, and the other 4 just need to know how to efficiently listen, follow instructions, and specialize. We started outsourcing intelligence. If your neighbor remembers the best way to grind grain, you no longer need the neural pathways dedicated to that specific problem. If the community elders store the complex history and astronomical cycles, your own high-level memory bank can be repurposed, or better yet, allowed to atrophy. We created an enormous distributed supercomputer. The city, the tribe, the network, and the individual nodes, us, could relax. We achieved an astonishing energy savings by letting the collective do the heavy lifting. The body, being the ultimate cost-benefit analyst, saw the opportunity. Why pay for 100% processing power when 85% is enough to survive and successfully breed within the safety net of the tribe? We traded individual mental ruggedness for collective efficiency. It's the ultimate evolutionary paradox. The creation of civilization allowed the individual human to get dumber without penalty. We became safer, more numerous, and more successful as a group. Precisely because we optimized out the metabolically expensive, intensely individualized intelligence that characterized the dangerous world of our forebears. The modern mind is, therefore, not weaker in all ways. It is hyper-specialized for cooperation, language, and abstract thought within a defined system. We are masters of the spreadsheet, the algorithm, and the complex social hierarchy. But strip away the civilization. Remove the network, the safety net, the stored information, and who is the superior model? The hunter who knows how to survive on 15% more processing power dedicated to the wild, or the architect who knows how to design a zero-emission building? The cold implication is this: we engineered ourselves into dependence. We became the ultimate domestic animal, incapable of surviving without the enclosure we built. And this leads us to the terrifying question of our future. We are watching the continued acceleration of this outsourcing. We are teaching algorithms to drive our cars, diagnose our diseases, manage our finances, and track our world. We are actively giving away the last few high-stakes cognitive tasks we held onto. If the hypothesis holds true, that the individual brain shrinks as the external support network grows more robust, what happens when we reach maximum automation? What happens when our 10 to 15% deficit grows to 20 or 25%? What happens when the domesticated creature needs to survive the return of the wild? Because history tells us one thing with absolute certainty: every single complex network, every glorious civilization ever built, eventually collapses. And when that complex external safety net inevitably fractures, the people left behind will need that aggressive, large-brained, high-stakes intelligence we optimized out of our DNA 20 millennia ago. Will we still have it? This is where the story gets profoundly unsettling, because we aren't talking about a gentle decline that started when our ancestors first stood upright millions of years ago. That was evolution. This is different. This brain shrinkage, this cognitive reduction, it happened recently. It happened to us. Academics across anthropology, paleoneurology, and archaeology are generally aligned on the timeline. The significant reduction in human brain size occurred between 20,000 and 10,000 years ago, roughly coinciding with the peak and the end of the last ice age, followed immediately by the dawn of agriculture. Think about that time frame. 20,000 years ago, you weren't looking at some squat hominin struggling to master fire. You were looking at anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, people functionally identical to you and me. They were painting the caves of Lascaux, building sophisticated tools out of bone and stone, navigating massive continents, and surviving unimaginable cold and scarcity. And they had bigger brains. We aren't talking about a few grams. The scientific data suggests we lost roughly 10 to 15% of our average cranial volume. If you put that into anatomical terms, you lost a mass roughly equivalent to a tennis ball, or maybe a grapefruit, depending on the model you prefer. And we lost it in a geological blink of an eye. The individuals living 20,000 years ago were, on average, more cognitively robust than we are today, according to the raw data of skull size. And that, frankly, scares the hell out of us because it flies in the face of the comfortable narrative of linear progress we've always told ourselves. So, the biggest question in paleoneurology is simple. Why did we shrink? The environment was brutal. The stakes were immediate and absolute. You had to be aggressive, alert, and capable of solving complex logistical problems on the fly, with zero margin for error, every single day. If the individual brain was the ultimate survival machine, shouldn't natural selection have continued to favor the biggest, most powerful processor? The answer, the consensus hypothesis that currently dominates the field, is deeply uncomfortable because it forces us to reconsider what we mean by survival. It suggests that the massive individual brain was no longer the most efficient survival strategy. We became domesticated. Yes, you heard that right. The leading theory holds that during this narrow 10,000-year window, Homo sapiens effectively domesticated itself. We optimized out the need for raw, aggressive, individual cognitive horsepower in favor of network efficiency and social compliance. Look at the history of animal domestication. It is an established, undeniable pattern. When you take a wild animal and domesticate it, whether it's a fierce Eurasian boar into a docile pig, a wild wolf into a companion dog, or a formidable wildcat into a purring house cat, The domesticated version always, reliably, has a smaller brain than its wild ancestor. Why? When you domesticate an animal, you are selecting for a suite of traits: smaller teeth, reduced robusticity in the skull and skeleton, lighter muscle mass, and most importantly, reduced aggression and a diminished flight response. The brain structures responsible for high-stakes, instant threat assessment, the crucial components of the limbic system. The areas dedicated to immediate fight or flight are less required when the individual is protected by the group and provided for by a reliable external source, the human master, or in our case, the human collective. When the cognitive load of survival shifts from the lone individual tracking prey over 100 miles in isolation to a cooperative group sharing resources and information, the necessity for a huge, metabolically expensive, instantly reactive brain drops dramatically. And here's the kicker! The exact time period when our brains began to shrink, the 20,000 to 10,000 year mark, also coincides precisely with the appearance of these classic domestication traits in the human fossil record. Our faces became less robust, our teeth became smaller, and our skeletal frame became lighter. We were, quite literally, evolving into a softer, less aggressive version of ourselves. We traded the ferocious, immediate intelligence of the lone hunter-gatherer, who had to know everything, remember every landmark, and calculate every trajectory without relying on anyone else, for the specialized, cooperative, distributed intelligence of the village, or the tribe. Think of it like this. Your Cro-Magnon ancestor was a supercomputer that had to run every single high-stakes program simultaneously, constantly, using massive amounts of energy and raw processing power. That brain was built for the wilderness, but once we started forming fixed communities, once we established specialization, once we figured out that you don't need to know how to track the reindeer if your neighbor Steve is the designated tracker and you, yourself, are the master basket weaver, your individual cognitive burden decreased. Evolution, that ruthless accountant, looked at that massive, energy-draining brain volume and asked, is 15% of this mass truly necessary when we have outsourced vigilance and critical logistical problem-solving to the collective? The answer, written in the shrinking of our skulls, was apparently no. We were selecting for the most cooperative, the most compliant, the least aggressive individuals, the ones who could function smoothly within the burgeoning social network. We were selecting for people who could handle the high cognitive load of social complexity, managing relationships, gossip, diplomacy, rather than the high cognitive load of existential survival, outsmarting a massive predator. We exchanged raw power for efficiency. We exchanged primal genius for social stability. But this raises a truly terrifying corollary to the self-domestication hypothesis. Did that lost 10 to 15% represent redundant storage, or did it contain the core software for aggressive, high-stakes, independent problem-solving, the intelligence necessary to reinvent civilization after the whole complex network inevitably breaks down? If the massive brain of our ancestor was the ultimate tool for surviving the wild, what happens when the soft, specialized, domesticated brain suddenly has to face that wild again? That is the terrifying question, isn't it? The core fear that nags at us when we discuss this great downsizing. Did we trade intellectual horsepower for comfort? Did the Stone Age genius, the man who could craft tools from bone and survive a Siberian winter alone, possess a raw computational capacity that the modern office worker simply lacks? And here's where the science pushes back, complicating the horror just enough to make it truly unsettling. Most researchers studying this phenomenon, this demiselence, are quick to stress that smaller doesn't necessarily mean stupider. If you look at it purely from an engineering standpoint, evolution doesn't reward redundancy. It rewards efficiency. The brain is the most gluttonous organ in the body. For an archaic Homo sapiens, those massive pre-shrinking brains demanded an insane metabolic toll. They hoovered up close to 20% of the daily caloric intake, sometimes more. That's an unbelievable amount of energy required just for maintenance, for basic operation, for the constant vigilance necessary to keep you alive in a world dominated by megafauna and sudden, brutal climate shifts. Imagine our ancestor, the one roaming the vast, unpredictable landscape of 30,000 years ago. He needed that robust, heavy-duty processing power. He needed instant, aggressive problem-solving capacity, the ability to process 1,000 environmental variables simultaneously, and the physical architecture, like heavy brow ridges and a thicker skull, to house and protect that demanding organ while regularly fighting for his life. That kind of genius is expensive. It's resource-intensive. But then we started domesticating ourselves. We started living in larger, denser groups. We began to cooperate, specialize, and share the burden of survival. What is the most efficient evolutionary hack you can possibly implement when survival becomes a team sport? You shed the costly, redundant hardware. The shift wasn't necessarily about losing intelligence. It was about optimizing the circuitry. We traded the vast, power-hungry mainframe of the Paleolithic for a streamlined, energy-efficient laptop, better suited for networking. We still have the same number of neurons, but they are packed differently. The white matter, the brain's wiring system, seems to have become denser, faster, perhaps specializing in the rapid communication needed for complex social interactions, gossip, negotiation, tracking favors owed, managing massive supply chains, even rudimentary politics. This is the physiological evidence of our collective soft-bellied future. You can see it not just in the size of the skull, but in the associated physical characteristics of domestication. The theory of self-domestication argues that as our brains shrank, we also saw a reduction in facial robustness, the lessening of heavy brow ridges, and a decrease in skeletal size and muscle mass compared to the last Ice Age populations. These changes are profoundly linked to aggression. When animals are domesticated, cattle, pigs, dogs, one of the first things that changes is their physical response to stress. They become less aggressive, less reactive. They lose the raw, explosive power of their wild ancestors. Physiologically, this often corresponds to lower circulating levels of testosterone and related stress hormones. Look at the archaeological record starting around 15,000 years ago. As the last glacial period was ending and human society began its exponential acceleration, we see the classic markers of the tamed species: decreased cranial volume and less pronounced sexually dimorphic traits, men and women starting to look slightly more alike in terms of skeletal structure. What was the ultimate evolutionary crucible for this specialized softer brain? Agriculture. Think about the revolutionary shift 10,000 years ago. The great hunter-gatherer, the walking encyclopedia of the wilderness, needed to know everything about everything: seasons, animals, tool-making, healing, warfare, shelter building. His survival depended on his own encyclopedic, high-resource brain. The early farmer, his survival depended on two things: planting the right seed at the right time, a specialized skill, and more crucially, his ability to manage his relationships within the village and the tribe. He needed the cooperation of 20 other people to successfully maintain the irrigation ditches, protect the harvest, and trade surplus goods. We essentially outsourced intelligence to the collective. You don't need to know how to track a deer for 3 days anymore. You just need to know how to manage the village census and calculate the interest on borrowed seeds. We became smarter, but you, the individual, became highly specialized and, dare we say it, dependent. And this is where the fear transitions from mere scientific curiosity to existential dread. We have built a magnificent global brain, a complex neural network of infrastructure, specialization, digital memory, and knowledge that dwarfs anything the Pleistocene mind could have conceived. But that system works only so long as the power stays on, the roads remain passable, the database remains intact, and the trust between specialized components holds firm. The highly specialized, socially domesticated brain is perfectly adapted to navigating the intricacies of modern urban life. We are experts at traffic patterns, bureaucracy, and niche digital programming. But take that same brain, your brain, my brain, and drop it back into the wild, unforgiving reality faced by our enormous-brained ancestors. What resources do we have left? We traded the robust, all-purpose, high-caloric survival tool for a delicate, specialized instrument designed purely for maximum societal efficiency. And what happens if the grand collective brain, this massive shared network we call civilization, suddenly fails? What happens when the highly efficient, specialized, and soft individual brain is forced to reckon with the raw, uncivilized demands of the long-forgotten wild? Did that 10 to 15% we shed 20,000 years ago represent unnecessary bulk? Or was it the essential, aggressive, independent operating system necessary to reboot civilization after a catastrophic crash? The terrifying truth is that we didn't just shrink our brains, we might have inadvertently engineered ourselves to be incapable of handling the very things that necessitated our evolution in the first place. True, sustained adversity. The history of humanity is littered with failed civilizations, societies that reached astounding heights only to vanish under the weight of climate change, plague, or warfare. In every single collapse, we see a crucial moment where the complex societal machine grinds to a halt, leaving the specialized citizen stranded. And if our soft, dependent brains are the result of thousands of years of selecting against aggression and independence, we have to ask, what happens when the only thing left to select for is raw, brutal survival? We're about to find out, because history suggests that the ultimate test of the domesticated brain isn't building a complex society, but surviving its inevitable, terrifying undoing. The great cruel paradox of human civilization, the very machine that allowed our brains to specialize and seemingly shrink, is that it is inherently fragile. We built structures of brittle complexity, systems designed for efficiency, not resilience. And when those systems snap, as they always eventually do, the highly refined, soft-brained specialist finds themselves utterly naked before a world their ancestors had already mastered tens of thousands of years ago. You, the modern citizen, whether you crunch numbers in an office, write code, or lecture on ancient philosophy, are a glorious achievement of specialization. You rely on millions of other specialized people to produce the food, maintain the infrastructure, and ensure the basic functioning of reality outside your immediate sphere of expertise. This extreme dependence is the biological cost of efficiency. We outsourced survival skills to the collective. But what happens when the collective vanishes? We don't need to theorize about this. We have archaeological evidence documenting this terrifying, systematic forgetting. Think about the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE. We often teach it as a footnote, a bunch of sea peoples, an internal conflict. But look closer. It was a complete civilizational reset across the Aegean, the Near East, and Anatolia. Monumental palaces were incinerated. Long-distance trade, the lifeblood of specialized society, ceased completely. And perhaps most chillingly, in Greece, writing simply stopped, gone. For the next 400 years, the people occupying the former Mycenaean strongholds lived in what historians call a dark age. They weren't using complex metalworking techniques, they weren't building sophisticated masonry, and they weren't recording their history. They forgot how to read and write. They forgot advanced technology. What we are looking at in the skeletal remnants of that age is not just a political shift. It is the physical evidence of cognitive systems failing. Imagine you are a highly educated bureaucrat in the palace of Pylos in 1250 BCE. Your entire self-worth, your skill set, revolves around deciphering the Linear B script and managing the complex distribution of olive oil and livestock. Your brain is a finely tuned instrument for abstract administrative thought. Then, the whole world burns. The next generation has no need for Linear B. They don't need complex accounting when they are fighting neighbors for scraps of barley. Their selection pressure fundamentally shifts away from abstract thought and back toward immediate brutal cunning, physical strength, and simple, transferable survival skills. The same terrifying dynamic played out, albeit slower, with the decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire. We look at the ruins of Rome and see a loss of political unity, but what the archaeology screams at us is a catastrophic loss of technical skill. The recipe for concrete was forgotten for centuries. Massive, efficient sanitation systems, the aqueducts, fell into disrepair because the specialized engineers who maintained them were gone, and the localized societies that replaced Rome lacked the cognitive infrastructure, the schools, the patronage, the tax base, to train new ones. We literally stopped building large structures. Artistry became crude. The complexity of coin metallurgy declined dramatically. We entered a long period defined by simplification, smaller populations, and a complete reversal of the trend toward high societal complexity. This is the archaeological footprint of a system that became too big, too complex, and ultimately too demanding for the specialized, interdependent brains it housed. This is where the terror of the shrinking brain truly hits home. If our ancestors, the ones who were already adapting to settled life, could forget how to read and build roads, what highly refined, deeply dependent skills are we, the modern, smaller-brained inheritors, ready to drop the moment the network fails? The theory of self-domestication suggests we achieved social harmony by selecting against aggression, hyperactivity, and intense physical resilience. We became milder, less physically robust, and behaviorally more pliable. But if the defining feature of societal collapse is the sudden, overwhelming reselection for those very traits we discarded, aggression, brutal independence, and immediate self-interest, then we are witnessing a terrifying biological reversal, de-domestication. When the veneer of civilization cracks, the smartest people are no longer the philosophers or the physicists, but the ones who know how to field, dress a carcass, or find clean water outside the municipal system. You are facing an immediate and ruthless selection against the traits that allowed you to thrive in peacetime complexity. And this reversal is fast. Evolution rarely moves in leaps, but selection pressure during collapse is a sledgehammer. The person whose brain is wired for navigating a complex legal database becomes less fit than the person whose brain allows for swift, often violent, territorial defense. We are talking about a societal collapse that doesn't just dismantle infrastructure, but actively begins favoring the traits we spent 20 millennia trying to eliminate. If the shrinkage was the cost of complexity, what will the cost of chaos be? Because we, as a species, are not immune to the cyclical nature of history. We built our specialized world on the promise of perpetual upward trajectory, ignoring the thousands of years of human history that prove that every height is followed by a devastating descent. And if the signs, climate instability, extreme social stratification, the brittleness of global supply chains are pointing toward another descent, then we have to confront the most profound and terrifying question imaginable. If survival demands a return to raw, primal instincts, and if those instincts are housed in brains fundamentally smaller and less physically robust than those of our Ice Age ancestors, what kind of human being will emerge from the wreckage? Will we shrink even further, becoming not just specialized, but pathetically dependent on the ruins of a world we can no longer maintain, until the only thing left is a creature optimized only for immediate, desperate savagery? We have to talk about the physical mechanism of the shrinking. We've established the fact that the volume changed. We've talked about the terrifying implications of what that means for a potential collapse, but understanding how it happened is necessary if we want to truly grasp the scale of the trade-off our species made 20 millennia ago. It's not just that the Ice Age ended and we got comfortable, it's that we fundamentally changed the evolutionary pressure we applied to ourselves. Think of it like this: evolution doesn't care about absolute intelligence. It cares about efficiency and successful reproduction. And when we started building permanent settlements, growing grain, and creating dense, complex social hierarchies, a process we call the Neolithic Revolution, we accidentally triggered a mass-scale genetic change known in biology as domestication syndrome. Now, you might think of domestication only in terms of dogs and cattle. But look closely at domesticated animals compared to their wild counterparts. Domesticated pigs, sheep, or foxes often exhibit similar traits: smaller brains relative to body size, smaller teeth and jaws, a reduction in skull robusticity, and crucially, decreased levels of reactive aggression. They are tamer. They retain more juvenile features into adulthood, a phenomenon called neoteny, and they require less physical strength to survive. Academics are now presenting increasingly rigorous evidence that we, Homo sapiens, are the ultimate product of self-domestication. We chose to live together in increasingly large and claustrophobic groups, where the most aggressive, the most physically dominant, the ones requiring the largest hunting territories, the archetypal Ice Age hunter, were systematically disadvantaged. They were selected against. If you were overly impulsive, violently dominant, or unable to cooperate and read complex social cues, you were more likely to be exiled, killed, or simply fail to pass on your genes in a dense communal setting. We selected for tameness. We selected for cooperation. And we paid a price for that tameness and cooperation in physical volume. When we compared the skeletal remains of Paleolithic humans to Neolithic humans, the changes are dramatic. Our faces became flatter. Our brow ridges diminished. Our entire craniofacial structure softened, and the skull, the vault protecting the brain, decreased in overall size. This wasn't some passive effect of the environment. This was an active evolutionary bottleneck applied by society itself. So, why did the brain specifically shrink? It comes down to one overwhelming factor that you rarely consider: the sheer metabolic cost. Your brain, right now, as you listen to this, is an energy black hole. Though it represents only about 2% of your total body weight, it consumes 20 to 30% of your entire resting metabolic rate. Think about that: 1/5 to 1/3 of all the calories you eat every single day, just to keep the lights on in that control center. Our ancestors, the robust Cro-Magnon who stalked mammoths, lived in an environment defined by caloric uncertainty. They needed massive, complex brains, not just for abstract thought, but for an astonishing degree of concrete, raw survival processing. They needed to store encyclopedic knowledge of migratory patterns across huge territories, detailed spatial maps of thousands of square miles, complex tracking algorithms for dozens of different prey species, and instant, split-second risk assessment, all in their own gray matter. Every cubic millimeter of that ancient brain was essential for maintaining the metabolic furnace required for survival in a volatile, unforgiving natural world. It was optimized for maximum capacity under extreme pressure. But when we invented agriculture, when we began storing grain and living in the same place year after year, something insidious happened. We traded high-quality, hard-to-find megafauna protein for lower-quality, easily storable carbohydrates. More importantly, we outsourced our knowledge. We no longer needed every single individual to be an encyclopedic wilderness expert. We didn't need the solo genius tracker. We needed the specialized farmer, the potter, the early bureaucratic organizer, the community elder who held the oral tradition. We moved from requiring a brain optimized for solitary, large-scale mapping and physical combat to needing a brain optimized for hyper-efficient social interaction and specialized labor. In this new environment, the village, the efficiency calculation flipped. The evolutionary pressure shifted from, how big a brain do I need to survive the wilderness alone, to how small a brain can I afford to maintain while still being a highly functional, specialized unit within the safety net of my community? The smaller, denser brain, potentially sacrificing some physical volume for structural refinement, a greater density of connections, or a slight change in the ratio of gray to white. Matter, the science is still arguing over the specifics, but the reduction in overall cranial size is undeniable, was simply cheaper to run. A slightly less metabolically expensive brain meant a higher chance of surviving a seasonal famine and passing on those genes. We chose efficiency over raw size, specialization over generalized robustness. This process, the metabolic optimization driven by self-domestication, is precisely why we are so terrified by the prospect of collapse. We didn't just shed a few cubic centimeters, we shed the redundancy. We traded the ultimate all-terrain survival machine for a sophisticated specialized road car. The road car is faster, better at calculating abstract mathematics, and capable of building immense systems. But if the paved roads disappear, if the fuel pumps stop working, and if the highly complex and fragile engine fails, that road car is utterly, tragically useless. It cannot traverse the terrain that its ancestral counterpart, the robust, slightly slower, energy-guzzling off-roader, was built to handle effortlessly. The question confronting us then is not whether we can still think abstractly. Of course we can. We built iPhones and launched rockets. The question is whether the intellectual specialization that led to the shrinking of our skulls also stripped away the necessary hardwiring for primal, durable survival. Did we domesticate ourselves into a state of terminal dependency? If the global system fractures, if the safety net of civilization fails, we will be forced back onto the rugged terrain of our ancestors, but with a chassis optimized only for the smooth, delicate highways of the information age. And that, truly, is the crux of the dark history we have authored. We stand on the precipice of potential involution, possessing the minds of brilliant architects, but potentially lacking the biological resilience of the Stone Age laborers who actually built the foundations of survival. We are entering a phase where the highly specialized knowledge we possess is useless without the infrastructure to support it. If your expertise is in quantum mechanics, but you don't know how to boil water without electricity, how much will that massive complex knowledge structure save you when the ice starts spreading again, or when the neighboring villages come searching for food? We have optimized our minds for the high altitudes of abstraction, but we are facing a devastating return to the low ground of biological necessity. And you have to ask yourself, was this trade-off worth the price? Did we unwittingly trade our ancient, durable strength for a temporary brittle reign? And what happens when the brittle system finally snaps? The system snaps not with a bang, but with the quiet, terrifying sound of a key institution failing, a drought that lasts too long, a plague that bypasses our best defenses, a grid failure that stretches from days into weeks. And when that complex, interdependent brittle structure shatters, we are forced back violently onto the low ground we worked 20,000 years to escape. And here is the critical irony, the final, dreadful twist of the dark history we have been tracing. If the brain reduction theory is correct, if we did, in fact, trade cubic centimeters of gray matter for social efficiency, then the very moment we need that ancestral durability, that vast, generalized cognitive power of the hunter-gatherer who knew how to survive alone, we will find it is gone. We optimized it out of existence. We stand here in the 21st century, the inheritors of a massive biological gamble. We took the most metabolically expensive organ in the history of life, and we said, we can make this cheaper. We can afford to be smaller. Why did we make that trade? The consensus academic theories point to three devastating conclusions, each one stripping away a layer of our perceived superiority. First, and perhaps most disturbing, is the domestication hypothesis. Look around you. When humans selectively breed animals for calmness, obedience, and manageable temperaments, like dogs, pigs, or cattle, a strange suite of characteristics always appears. Smaller jaws, smaller teeth, less reactive aggression, and, critically, smaller brains. We didn't just domesticate Ryan goats, we appear to have self-domesticated ourselves. We punished aggression. We rewarded cooperation. We eliminated the need for the rapid, massive cognitive firepower required for high-stakes, constant territorial conflict or solitary big-game hunting. The tamer we became, the less physically and cranially massive we needed to be. The Paleolithic man, robust and ever vigilant, needed the neural architecture to survive an ambush or a sudden confrontation with a rival tribe or a mammoth. The Neolithic farmer, settled in a village of 500, relied on social contracts and shared defenses. The physical energy needed to sustain that ancient aggressive brain was no longer worth the metabolic cost in a cooperative society. We literally bred the wildness out of ourselves, and our crania shrank as a result of that collective tranquility. The second theory, the one that really makes you pause, is the cognitive load sharing hypothesis. This is the ultimate cost of community. Imagine the Homo sapiens 30,000 years ago. Every single individual needed to carry, inside their own skull, a comprehensive map of the migration routes, the toxic plants, the complex social genealogies, the stone knapping techniques, and the massive oral history of their entire clan. Their brain was a sovereign nation. It had to house all the essential infrastructure. But then came the agricultural revolution, the rise of specialized labor, and crucially, the invention of external storage. Symbolic thought, writing, libraries, and eventually, the cloud. We outsourced our memory. We outsourced our calculations. You don't need to calculate the structural integrity of your house. A specialized engineer does that. You don't need to remember every known medicinal herb. The pharmacopoeia remembers it. The village, the city, the network, it became our collective external brain. Our minds did not become dumber. They became optimized for retrieval, connection, and specialization. We traded depth for reach. We optimized away the necessity of holding 10,000 facts in favor of knowing 10 specific facts deeply, and knowing precisely which neighbor, book, or server holds the other 9,990. But think about the consequence. If you are cut off from the network, if the infrastructure fails, if the brittle system snaps, you are suddenly an expert quantum mechanic who cannot survive a week without modern plumbing. You are incomplete. The ancient brain was a comprehensive survival kit. The modern brain is merely an operating system designed to run specialized apps which require constant power and connectivity. And that brings us to the final, pragmatic, and perhaps saddest conclusion. Metabolic efficiency. The brain, even a slightly smaller one, demands a staggering 20% of the body's entire resting metabolic energy. It is an incredibly expensive luxury item. In the unpredictable, often starving climate shifts of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, every single calorie counted. When massive climate instability forced us to adopt agriculture, a system that produced more calories overall, but required far less complex, flexible, generalized intelligence for daily survival than hunting did, our bodies made a terrifying calculation. The pressure wasn't to be smarter, the pressure was to survive the next famine. And evolution, being brutally pragmatic, favors survival over intellectual extravagance. We shrunk the brain because we could afford to. We got smarter about being cheaper to run. We are, biologically, the successful products of a sustained period of low-pressure, high-density social living. We evolved to survive civilization, not the wilderness. And that, my friends, is the terrifying core of our dark history. We succeeded. We won the evolutionary race by becoming interdependent, by becoming tamed, and by reducing the physical mass required to house our knowledge, because we built libraries and infrastructure to carry the weight for us. We exchanged the generalized, durable strength of the solitary survivor for the fragile, brilliant specialization of the modern collective. We are the most advanced species ever to walk the earth, but we are also the most biologically dependent on our own scaffolding. So, when you look at the evidence, the 10 to 15% reduction in cranial capacity since the peak 20,000 years ago, you are not looking at a history of failure. You are looking at a history of radical, brutal optimization. We did not regress. We streamlined, and in that streamlining, we created a massive vulnerability. We have authored a history where our greatest triumph, civilization itself, is also the thing that makes us most fragile. The ultimate question we face, as this brittle system groans under the weight of climate crises and resource instability, is not whether we are smart enough to build the future, but whether we still possess the ancestral biological resilience to survive its collapse. We achieved consciousness, we built the pyramids, we split the atom, we mapped the stars, but we did it by sacrificing the foundational capacity for solitude, for physical durability, for generalized survival. We are geniuses standing on a scaffolding of glass, and we will only know if that trade-off was worth the price when the glass finally breaks. The dark history is not over. The ultimate test of the diminished mind is just beginning, and the shadows of the ancient massive-brained humans are watching us from the deep past, waiting to see if their smaller, cheaper descendants can survive the long night ahead.